the workhorses of the task force. As Hermes came within flying range of the Falklands, stockpiles of the bombs and rockets her Harriers would carry came up onto the deck. A Vulcan bomber from Ascension had already dropped its bombs on the airport at Port Stanley. Now it was the Harrier's turn. In the Hermes flight control, the order was given for the first airstrike from the task force. It was to be the first of 1,000 Harrier missions flown during the conflict. They watched them till they were out of sight and prayed they would all return. Port Stanley lay calm and quiet in the early dawn. At the airport 2 miles away across the bay, the defenders waited for the air raid they knew must come.
Vemos que se responde a los disparos que efectúan las Malvinas.
The Harriers came in from different directions in a classic figure-of-8 attack pattern. They were in and out again so fast that the flak thrown up by the enemy hit the empty sky far behind them. The ambulances rushed into town with the injured. Around the airport, there was chaos. Soldiers and Argentine civilians ran through the wreckage and the craters to put as much distance between them and any further attacks as possible. The Harriers were to return again and again, not just to Port Stanley, but to several grass airstrips where the Argentines were mustering aircraft. And afterwards, the key question: had they put the airfield out of action? High-level reconnaissance photographs of Port Stanley, of which this was the first, showed apparent success. Only much later was it learnt that the Argentines had been dumping huge mounds of earth on the runway, shaping them to look like craters, and always leaving one side of the runway free for their aircraft to land or take off. Of 63 bombs dropped here, only 1 hit the runway. Far from the garrison being cut off, as intended, they were receiving fresh supplies right up to the day before the surrender. Out on Hermes, there were cheers as they watched the Harriers return out of the leaden sky. News of the mission was flashed back to Britain, but journalists with the task force under strict military censorship weren't allowed to say how many planes had taken part. One reporter, Brian Hanrahan, told the country of the jet's safe return with the reassuring words, "I counted them out and I counted them back." Only one of the Harriers had been hit, a single bullet through the tail, evidence that it had missed its pilot by a fraction of a second. Days later, another Harrier would be shot down as it attacked Goose Green. 2 more would vanish after colliding in bad weather, but that was still to come. What mattered today was the first taste of action, the brush with danger, the first success, and the relief of the backup crews. Flight Lieutenant David Morgan inspected the damage to his plane. Harriers would be scrambled again that day to counter an Argentine air attack. And after the mission, a debriefing on their first taste of war.
My first bomb probably took out an aircraft which was on the northern side of the airfield, a little light aircraft. And then the remaining 2 rolled across the airfield into the pan. which was actually full of smoke and flames already at this stage.
What did it look like?
The airfield itself was just a great, well, the airport buildings were just a very large area of fire and smoke and dust. You couldn't actually pick out very little detail in there because there was so much.
Could you see people on the ground?
No, you couldn't see any people. I think they were all pretty well down foxholes, but you could see a lot of guns firing.
Beneath the sea, British submarines were also patrolling what had now become a 200-mile total exclusion zone around the Falklands. There was some criticism of the fact that Argentina's second biggest warship, the General Belgrano, and 2 escorting frigates were just outside the zone when the hunter-killer submarine HMS Conqueror fired 2 Tigerfish torpedoes towards her. Hit amidships, the Belgrano sank rapidly. 360 of her crew died, 800 were rescued. And the British submarines were under standing orders to mete out the same treatment to the big Argentine carrier 25 de Mayo if she dared leave port. She never did. When the Conqueror returned later to the Clyde, her captain, Christopher Reeford Brown, defended the decision to sink the Belgrano.
She was a threat to the task force. She'd been steaming towards them, and I'd been watching her for a few hours beforehand, and under direct orders I went in and attacked her. I think by doing so, although there was obviously loss of life on her, which I regret, I certainly saved considerable loss of life from the British task force.
Just hours after the Belgrano was hit, Lynx helicopters returned from a task force mission with some of their missile mounts empty. 2 Argentine patrol boats had fired on a Sea King